Today we are interviewing Pamela J. Gregory, who is retired as the law librarian for the Circuit Court for Prince George's County in Maryland. Pam, or as she prefers to be called, currently remains active as a consultant. Pam, let's begin with a little personal history. Can you tell us about where you were raised and about your life both when you were young and today?
Well, Pat, my dad was an Air Force Chief Master Sergeant, and that was his career. And he was a soldier in World War II, in Korea, and also he didn't actually physically go to Vietnam, but he prepared airplanes and men and materiel for the Vietnam War. And I was very, very proud of my dad. On his veterans tombstone are all of the wars, you know, the WW2 in Korea. So we literally lived all over the world. He was in Korea twice, and Japan, and many European tours, England, France, mostly France and Germany, but England also, and Italy at one time, and lots of homes. When my dad was doing the Korean tours, we had a house in Des Moines, Iowa, which is where my elementary education was. And my mom and younger siblings were living on Merle Hay Road in Des Moines, Iowa. I was back in the Midwest for a family reunion in August and rented a car and drove all over Des Moines. My brother, who is now in Kansas City, was amazed that I had the recollection that I had of Des Moines. But, you know, I really, from first grade through sixth grade, on and off, were living with Mom in that pretty little neighborhood in Windsor Heights, which is now a suburb of Des Moines. My mom and dad met in high school. They were both from Iowa farm families. My mom's family having been in a land grant Iowa farm. And we saw that back in August too. So Midwest upbringing primarily. And I actually came to this area because my dad was assigned in France at an installation where a branch of the University of Maryland was, and came to this part of the world to finish studying at the University of Maryland. So that's how I got from there to here.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like you lived in some very interesting places over the years, but I didn't hear you mention anything about living inside a library or law library. So could you tell us a little bit about how it came about that you decided to become a law librarian?
Yes, surely.
Did anybody play a role in that?
Oh, many people. When we were living in the Midwest, and I was off on a summer vacation, I think I must have been about 9 or 10, I walked up to the library and attempted to charge out a copy of Gone with the Wind, because it was the first day of my summer vacation and I wanted the biggest book I could take home. And the lady who was the librarian at that time, named Hazel P. Odell, informed me that I could not take that book out, that I was under 12 years of age, and that that book had obscene swear words in it. Well, I was mortified that I couldn't take a book out of the library, and I walked home to my mom in tears and said, Mommy, they won't let me take this book out. And my mother took me by the hand and we walked back uptown to the library, and she signed the permission slip with Hazel P. Odell that I could read Gone with the Wind. And I remember my mother saying to the librarian, you know, my daughter can read any of the books in the library. Well, my mother tells this story with great laughter, bless her soul, because of course the only bad word in Gone with the Wind was rat to Charlotte. And I treasured that opportunity to read that book. And
that word's even in the movie.
It's in the movie, and what's funny about it is that I came away thinking, I'm going to be a librarian when I grow up because they have a lot of power. They have a lot of authority to tell people what they can and can't read. So as it turns out, I was able to go to work for Hazel P. Odell. She was not only the town librarian, but she was also the school librarian. And so, Pat, the only jobs I've ever had are in libraries, starting way back then, when I worked at Study Hall, and I got 75 cents an hour working for Hazel P. Odell. And Miss Odell, bless her heart, expanded the City Hall Library in that little town, and she was quite a lady. She was the first librarian that I knew. And then as I came to Washington and began to meet people around town, the job that I had at National Academy of Sciences, which was titled bibliographer, brought me into the Library of Congress on pretty much a daily basis. I was in school part-time at the University of Maryland. I was taking, in some cases, I was taking 18 hours. And Gene Neighbors, God bless him, taught me legislation. I learned at his knee how to find session laws and going through the congressional record and using those indices. I was registered at the time in Stan Bugas's, I think it was called a government documents class, but I'm not real positive. In any event, Stanley was a great guy. He was a law librarian then at the Department of Commerce. And he had a tremendous handlebar mustache and was a very fun-loving kind of guy. And you sort of, he reminded you a little bit of Groucho Marx. You'd see Stan and you'd try to remember the secret word. Well, those of us in his class sort of felt that he was giving us a lot, but we wanted more detail in our legal bibliography. And since I was working, I knew Signe Larson over at the Department of Interior. And Signe had just signed up for Jack Ellenberger's legal research class. And she said, why don't you come and take this class with us, Pam? It's really, really good. So it was a couple nights a week over at the old USDA, and Jack was teaching, and he really socked it to us. I mean, we had thick assignments that I still remember taking hours to finish, but boy, did you learn legal bib. And I was so grateful, and Jack was so encouraging that he said, you've got to take a job in law librarianship. Well, I wasn't really making all that much money at the academy, although I loved the work. I really loved the work. The freedom to be able to go to the Library of Congress, the freedom to get, in those days you could actually get in the stacks, to work with the people I did there. I had the privilege of working with Anthony Lewis of the New York Times when he was working on Pruitt-Igoe, the ultimate destruction of that public housing area. And Mr. Lewis wrote a wonderful, wonderful letter as the project ended, saying, you know, that he could not have completed the work without the attention that we'd been able to give him. And it was just such a privilege to know that he was going to utilize what I pulled off the shelf. And I got kind of a thrill from that. But I really loved that legislation, and I really loved the work of Congress. And Jean wanted me to apply, Jean Neighbors wanted me to apply for either a CRS position or some clerical something to get me an LC. And I just, in those days, it was late 60s, the new building hadn't been built, and LC was sort of chaotic, and as much as I loved being around all those books and all those people, I thought I might want to do something else. So in 1970, I got a job, actually late 69, I think, got a job with the National Machine Tool Builders Association, which included records and a small library collection. And I was responsible really for helping shepherd and organize their legislative activity. And I learned a very great deal. And I was privileged at that time to still keep in touch with Jack, because Covington and Burling were our council. And so that's kind of how I got my first exposure to the Law Librarian Society. Jack made me come to meetings and said, "You've got to come to meetings. You've got to get a law library job." So in roughly 1970, Peyton Neal met my good friend Darlene Perry, who was then law librarian in Prince George's County. The story is that Darlene and Peyton were in a swimming pool, and Peyton said, you know, what will you do when you finish law school? And she said she wanted to become a public defender, which she did. Subsequently became a judge. Well, Peyton said, "I know somebody who would really like to interview for your job." And that someone was me. Well, there I was in my ponytail, and went out to the courthouse, got stuck in the elevator, scared to death to meet a judge. I'd never in my life met a judge. And was interviewed by William Bell Bowie, who was the library liaison judge at the time. And I got the job. And back then there were 9 of them, 9 circuit court judges. They're now, I think, 30-something. And it was a little courthouse in one building where all of county government existed under one roof. Now, you know, the whole town is nothing but government buildings, and it reminds me, you know, when I come into this library where we are now in Montgomery County. When I first came to visit Montgomery County, those many, many years ago, they were in what is now the district court building. And the library was pretty much on one floor then, maybe about 1/4 the size of this facility. But to see the justice system grow to meet the needs of these suburban counties has just been something, just something. I guess of the jobs that I had prior to taking the National Academy of Sciences jobs, the jobs working in the student study hall library in high school. And also, when my dad was in France, I had a USIA 3-day-a-week job with a facility near Nancy. And then de Gaulle threw us out in 1966, which is USIA dissolved a lot of its contacts. I often hearken that the European exposure did me a lot of good. I had fun because the USIA libraries were really public libraries, and they were also diplomatic and fascinating collections. But that's how I got the start, and Peyton and Jack were responsible for providing support and references, especially in the beginning.
Well, the story is indeed interesting. I was thinking when you were talking about being initially told by the local librarian that Gone with the Wind was something inappropriate for children of your vintage. I thought, boy, if she had only asked to read Andersonville, you probably now would be running again for president or something of the United States after that. But the reason I think of that is that when I was in high school, I went to a Jesuit school, and they had a reading list of recommended books. Andersonville was on it.
Wow.
Until the good fathers discovered that it wasn't just about a prison during the Civil War. There was a house of ill repute next door.
I was going to say
it was about that too.
General Hooker was mentioned in that book. Yes, well.
Yeah, and we were told, oh, we weren't supposed to read that. I think probably every kid in the school did after we were told that that book shouldn't have been on the list.
Of course, and then everybody would want to. It would thrill everybody. Well, you have to understand, from my perspective, I took it off the shelf because it was the biggest book I could see.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to read. I wanted to read that book.
Well, for a long time it was about the biggest in terms of length movie there was out there too.
Yeah, an amazing story.
Yeah.
So when I reflect on reasons for becoming interested in libraries and becoming interested in being a reader, that was the first big book I tackled.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly is a good story. You know, in today's world, you sort of wonder, it tells you a lot about how things were then, and certainly different than today.
Yeah, you learned a lot. You learned about slavery and birth and babies and all that other
all
good
that
stuff.
sort of thing, yes.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've talked a little bit about how you got into the field and the jobs you've had and some of the things you've done, but is there anything else that comes to mind? You were at PG County, Prince George's County, Maryland. I should spell it out for our viewers, which is right just barely east of the District of Columbia. It abuts the district. And you were county law librarian there for many, many years.
Yes, yes.
Could you talk a little bit about some of the other changes you've seen in the library there, and besides the addition of more and more buildings and more and more courts? And
you know, I reflect on this periodically. I worked hard, but I was also fortunate to be employed with a group of professionals who trusted me and who really had a good fix on permissive management, and they backed me up when they needed when I needed backing up, and I never felt that I was working in a vacuum. I always felt that I was a part of something. And I had a pretty high degree of autonomy. And my old friend Ed Bellefontaine, who was at Social Law Library in Boston, used to say to me, never let them see you sweat, Pammy, but don't let them forget either. And don't you forget that you work for them. go by periodically and say, how am I doing? You know, just don't let them think that you're out there all on your own. And it was, at times it was easy to do, you know, you just want to say, I've got this budget, I've got this unmitigated demand on our resources. Please give me more money, please give me more staff. And sometimes that'd work and sometimes it wouldn't. But mostly I learned to partner. I learned to partner with the Bar Association. I learned to partner with the community college. My outreach was with the people who were my users. And because of that outreach, I was able to do things like bring in the first public terminal for Westlaw. I had a library chairman, Jason Amster, and then later a public defender, library chairman, Tony McCarthy, who spoke up with the bar. And Jason, God love him, just said, you know, we need to do this. We need to do this. We are going to be entering an age of electronic usage, and I want our librarian and all of us to have this privilege. And off we went, and we modeled our plan on one similar to the Social Law Library in Boston. And because my colleagues in Boston and also Philadelphia had done these programs, I was able to have a model to follow and an example to use. Regina Smith in Philly followed Jill Kramer, and Jill and I and Edgar Bellefontaine had the first 3 public Westlaw terminals in the country.
Wow.
Well, it was an exciting thing, Pat, and you know, the question of what changes did I see? Well, you know, I came into that job and I had a Westlaw rep from the first day, Chet Flieger, who stood by me, who did what they used to do in the old book days, where they would come and they would check your shelves and they would make sure your pocket parts were current and they would make sure that you weren't missing anything. And if you had Shepherd's, you had your table, you know, your table volumes, and you had your shelf setup was correct. And you know, you learned a very great deal from those guys, and Chet in particular had a great way of helping. And on his last day on the job, he brought the Westlaw terminal, and he plugged it in, and he said, "It's time for me to go." And I thought at the time, well, it's sort of the end of an era and the beginning of another. And you know, we had then, Pat, the acoustic coupler. You took the phone.
I remember those.
Remember the acoustic coupler?
Dial the line up to get the computer, and then plug this thing into
That's exactly
into its
right.
cradle, and the machine could talk to the computer on the other end.
I remember we had Judge Dudley Diggs then, who was still alive, who was our appellate judge in residence, and he came by and shook his head and he said, "Electronic marbles, where will we be?" But then, bless his heart, he got me on the state committee with my good friend Mike Miller, and I ended up serving on all the state contract committees forevermore as a result of being in that first payload of electronic experience. And we survived it, and then added Luxus. What I did do in position, Pat, was relocate 3 times. And I had, on the second design of the library, I had the most say on the design elements. That was done by a local firm. And then the third iteration of the library was done by the St. Louis firm that does courthouses, and I've blocked their name out somehow or other. But they were not hands-on people, and the library kind of we ended up with compact shelving and some other things that I would have preferred that we didn't have. You know, you really need a rectangular space. You don't need a space around an atrium, which is what we ended up with, along with 2-story ceilings and lights that had to be changed with cherry pickers. And
I remember I visited that library one time, and it was impressive to see.
Oh,
You
it was
came into the
beautiful.
building,
It
but,
was beautiful.
wasn't as functional, I guess,
It
as it
just
might have been had it, the people who designed it
well, if they
been
paid
library
attention.
users and knew what
Yeah.
they were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was a disappointment to me, but who knew what we'd all look like in a decade?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you come into a facility like this one now, and there are 3 public terminals immediately, and 4 more as you go down the hall. And that's what you have.
Yeah.
That's what you have.
Perhaps for the benefit of our viewers who are looking at whatever's right behind you on the wall and in the room, we're actually sitting for this interview at the Montgomery County, Maryland Circuit Court building in Rockville, Maryland, in the law library. And,
That's right.
Our counterpart in this library, Kate Martin, has been very generous to allow us to do a number of these interviews here today.
Well, of course, I've known Kate through all of her years of librarianship, and it's been fun.
Mm-hmm. That sort of naturally leads me into the next item of focus for the interview that I'd like to have, because you know, we all got to know Kate because she was so active in the associations and so on, but you were too.
Oh, yes.
In fact, you in many diverse and very important ways. I remember particularly your work for the Law Librarian Society of Washington, D.C., including your year as its president, and the fact that you've also been a leader in the State Court and County Law Librarian Special Interest section of AALL, and in the Law Library Association of Maryland as well, which sort of sprung up around sort of the Baltimore group,
Right.
which was a little bit up the road to be coming in for dinner meetings in Washington of the society, but I think the 2 chapters have worked well together over the years too, including on some joint projects.
For sure.
Yeah.
Joint Spring Workshop.
Yeah. Could you perhaps talk a little bit about some of your experiences in these groups and perhaps other professional groups that in which you've been active over the years?
Well, I loved AALL, and my first meeting was in 1970. That was the meeting, Patrick, that you did the exhibits for, and were such a big financial. You and Steve Marchton did the planning on the financial part of those exhibits.
Yeah.
And brought some money
That was
in.
wild because we didn't have any headquarters staff. They hadn't yet hired an executive director.
Right.
The staff consisted of Babe Russo,
Right.
but she didn't deal with exhibit halls. That was part of the local group, and so Steve and I did. But
Well, Jack Ellenberger, God bless him, made me head of registration and doing those local packets for that 1970 meeting, and I didn't know what I was getting into. But I met an awful lot of people that year who became lifelong friends. And I ran registration, and I met Elizabeth Finley, and I met Bernie Turbeville, and Bill Murphy for the first time, and Tom from Berkeley, and I think Tom Reynolds was then in academia still. Yeah, he had only always been in academia.
Mhm.
Tom became a friend, and I hearken back to that 1970 meeting of the people that I worked with, and many of them are gone, but many of them were my friends, forevermore.
Mhm.
Ann Puckett, George Grossman. I was also chair of what was Contemporary Social Problems,
Mhm.
Pat. And one of the things that I did that I was very proud of was I was the first person to get a grant for the association, outside the association, with the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation to distribute copies of the Oceana publication, the Prisoner's Self-Help Litigation Manual.
Mhm.
And I became interested in that project through my ACLU activities. And I knew with the ACLU contacts and with Phil Cohen's generous desire to get this volume into prisons that we'd be able to do that. So what we did was all of the prisons that had purchased the library service to prisoners bibliography and standards book, we gave a free copy of the self-help litigation manual. Bob Baring was president at that time, and I don't think that you could, in today's AALL, have just said to an energetic member, "You want to get a grant? Go for it, sweetie," which is exactly what Bob Baring said, and exactly what I did. I made an attempt early on to say, "Bob, do we have to bring this before the board? Because if we do, I'm going to have to get my ducks in a row." And he said, "Nah, you just go to New York. If you want to get that money, you go ahead." And I came back with a check.
Mhm.
So that was nice, and the folks at then Contemporary Social Problems were supportive, and I got the chairmanship of that group and did with Mary Vela Krashel, we did the Equal Pay for Equal Work resolution. And with Ann Puckett, we did the, and Elizabeth Slusser Kelly, we did the nuclear non-proliferation. And Liz Slusser Kelly, was very, very interested in faculty status and faculty salaries among women academics, and that led to my interest in the salary survey. And again, following, and I don't mean to get my colleagues in any kind of hot water, but again, following Bob Baring's lead, Penny Hazelton in her presidency said to me, "Just let's get a cut on this salary survey." She said, "I don't care if it's got warts. We need to start someplace."
Mhm.
So I was gutsy, and I had a colleague who was working on a PhD, and she needed a project. So I brought her to AALL, and we did the first salary survey. And it did have some warts, and we did make some mistakes, and we were working on a PC that was not big enough to do the job, and we had to get back up. We learned so much on that project, but we got the first one out, and we were able then to have a model, and we were able then to say to the committee, "Okay, well, clean it up, look at it." but at least we made a start. And Penny and I did a dance the next time we saw each other, and she said, I don't think I would have ever found anybody else to be brave enough to go out and try it. Because, you know, I have to say this about the board of that wonderful organization. They got to be, in my opinion, sort of interested in labels, and it is the nature of librarianship to label and categorize and classify. But Lordy, you know, we came to a point where, honestly, in AALL, I began really getting worried about how we were doing programs. We were so insular. We were too insular. And I noticed in my email this morning, and I'm still a member, and I always will be, I'm a member of the now social responsibilities section, and the social responsibilities folks are worried about spending money for an outside speaker. And I'm going to write an email when I get home and say, hey, break out some of that dough and let's go, because we need to hear from outside influences, speakers. Now, the state court and county folks, Pat, I worked primarily with standards for them, and also with the National Center for State Courts on library standards, with Eric Lowe and Peggy Rogers and the people who were there at the National Center. My boss, Lawrence L. Martin, who was the library liaison in later years during my tenure at the court, went with me, and we taught library standards and library practices for court libraries together. And the judge became very interested, Lawrence L. Martin became very interested in library service to the public. And that was in the time when the pro se activity was beginning. Now the last 10 years were really the pro se years. And that's a part of, I should compartmentalize that. And before I tell you about the pro se years, I should tell you about the other group that I was involved in. And I'm going to put my glasses on.
Okay.
And get my list up here.
It's always tricky to start talking about people, and it's so easy to leave somebody out.
Well,
it shouldn't be.
Absolutely.
Better to have a list.
Absolutely.
I agree with you.
When we were in Philadelphia for SCCLL, and that was the year I was chair, we set up with Charlie Dyer, through Charlie Dyer and Shirley David, the California librarians, we set up the first trustees luncheon of membership libraries. Charlie having published with Shirley the trustees manual, the California model, which has served as a manual for library trustees throughout the country. That was, Charlie really deserves credit for many things, but of the work that he did, that trustees manual turned out to be just a godsend, because it told that lawyer trustee or that judge trustee what was expected of them and what the library needed from them. And we helped get that published, and Charlie in particular had our undying gratitude for that. But I want to talk about the membership subscription roundtable. And it served really as a whole focus for my professional career after 85 and 86. In that group were Carol Meyer from Cincinnati, Jean Holcomb from Norfolk and later Seattle, Anne Grand from Minneapolis, Regina Smith from Philadelphia, Anne Matthewman from Toronto, Edgar Bellefontaine and Maria Sekula from Social Law Library in Boston, Charlie Dyer from San Diego County, Judy Meadows joined our group in, I think, the early 90s. Marcia Kozlov from LA County, Shirley David from Sacramento, Nancy Joseph from the New York Law Institute, now Ralph Monaco from the New York Law Institute, and Fred Baum from the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. All libraries serving a membership service with the practicing bar.
Mhm.
And included in that were Kyun Chu of Baltimore, and later Donna Bausch, who replaced Jean Holcomb in Norfolk. That was my group of colleagues and my real mainstay. Every year we met annually at somebody's library,
Mhm.
and we had a 3-day meeting. And during that meeting, we had a program from outside. We would get our bar association to sponsor a speaker, and we would bring in that person, and it would be maybe a equal employment opportunity lawyer, or it would be the dean of a law school, or it would be whatever it was and whoever it was, who would say to us, this is what you need to do in an employment situation. Usually the speakers were employment related, or we went on for years with whose staff hassles and the library clerks coming in with blue hair, the things that they don't teach you in law school or library school. I remember one funny meeting when Marcia Kozlov came in and said she had been by to lecture her library school class, and she had to tell them that she was late for class because she was dealing with someone who was no longer living under one of the bushes in the library. Not funny at the time. Marcia had to get an ambulance and get the city morgue and do all the things you have to do when you're removing. And she said, the library students looked at her and looked around the room, and it turns out that it was something that the librarian had to take care of.
Sure.
Because it was a public building in Los Angeles County, and she had to take care of it. She had to be present. She had to sign the forms. So they don't tell you things like that. I mean, they don't tell you. And we had a wonderful speaker once on communication. A guy that I had heard from a business school program at the University of Maryland. And he's now doing seminars and earning a very great deal of money. He was kind enough to come and speak to us in Norfolk for about $800 and a free dinner. But, I look back on those meetings, and I look back on how important those annual reports from each other were to all of us. And we could stop and we could raise our hands and say, so Edgar, how many sets of shepherds do you have, and why so many? And we helped each other out in ways that I can never tell you. Some of them were substantive and very real in terms of the moral support. I recall, Pat, the first week or the second week, or very early on in the public terminal program, I had one of those life-altering conversations with Maria about how important she felt our interpretation of the user's question was. She said, it's one thing to say you can't practice law with a book, and another thing to say you can't practice law and sit down and start typing the terms on a terminal. And I reflected on that subsequently and thought, you know, she has a point.
Mhm.
It's a whole other layer of interpretation that we're doing with this electronic retrieval.
Mhm.
So we also had, one year, we had our library bar council come to speak with us on the ethics. And he came away saying, what an erudite and marvelous group of people. He said, you know, I have no idea how hard it must be, especially for those who had the law degrees, to involve themselves in that day-to-day understanding. And Janet, who was Kate's predecessor here, of course, started life as a practicing attorney, became a law librarian, went to library school, became a law librarian. Janet used to say the hardest thing she had to do was step back objectively. And so that brings me to a segue that can talk about the last and final kind of sea change iteration. It became obvious in the 90s that we were going to have to alter the way we approached our use with the public. And so picking up in courthouses were volunteer lawyers' services, and they were aligned with libraries. And usually they started in a modest way. In my library, they started 1 day a week, and then they grew to 3, and then they grew to 5. And then they became part of the services that the court offered. And there was so much gnashing of teeth from the bar. You're taking clients from us, you're taking clients from us. Well, maybe we were, but my response to them was, you want these clients? Come sit between 9 and noon, and you tell me you want to see these people in your office. Be my pleasure to share that with you. And you know, there were so many wonderful, wonderful people in my community in Upper Marlboro. Those old family Southern men and women who were brought up to give back. And they made the rank and file of those volunteer lawyers. And because of that, Bob Bell, the Honorable Robert Bell, gave me a 2-year appointment to the Maryland Legal Assistance Network for formulating that group. And I was fortunate and have been fortunate in knowing Charlie Dyer, because he gave me a model to write a grant as a result of the MLAN board service to get a grant to train public librarians. And of course, Charlie was the first among us, and Anne Grand subsequently in Minneapolis, to partner with public libraries to train public librarians to start the road to help answer legal questions. And really and truly, the work that we did, Charlie particularly became very active with Richard Zorza, who is the self-help guru. Charlie got very tight with him and began consulting with him. And they were effective, Charlie and Richard Zorsa were effective in getting a grant from the Gates Foundation to help train public librarians. And my last speech, 2 years after I retired, was with Charlie and with Judy, and we were all in San Francisco, and we were with Lisa Rush, who is a young mentee of mine from Tarrant County in Austin, Texas. We were all together. Marsha Kozlov was there, Marcus Hofstetter from Seattle. And Judy said, finally they've heard us. You know, here we are all. And that's the last time I saw Judy and the last time I saw Charlie. We were consulting with training for public librarians.
Well, you'll be able to see them again in a way because both of them have been interviewed for this project. And when these
Wonderful.
are up on Hein Online, there they will
I'm so
be.
happy. Well, I hope they took a little time out to talk about it too, because you know these contacts are synergistic, and you were helpful to me too because you knew the first legal aid director, Pat, the man with all the kids, Charlie, what was his name? Gosh, I've lost it, and that's embarrassing. But the AU project with the Justice Library brought me to Bob Rudy and the legal aid people who ultimately gave me an office in Baltimore.
Yeah, that's right. The National Equal Justice Library
National Equal Justice
was
Library.
initially at AU. Now it's at Georgetown.
Now it's at Georgetown. And you, I know you were responsible for getting me that gig.
Well, I don't know.
Well, I think you may have been. I don't know who did that, but that was helpful.
I think it's a matter of who did I know
Right.
who I knew would be good at
Would be
it.
liberal enough to want to come on board and help with it.
Yeah.
And it was a great project, and it was a privilege. And, you know, all these things with respect to the career, I've been so fortunate. I say often, when I talk to people who've come out of teaching or come out of, my volunteer work now has been with the archives at Hornbeck, which are not inconsiderable. They are amazing. You know, I had a project with T.S. Eliot's Wasteland manuscript in which I gave advice to a scholar in Oxford. That took a semester, and I had to be bonded. We're done?
We're not quite done, but we're getting close, so I wanted to signal that.
Okay. In any event, that led me to my love now of things rare and archival. And that's my next hope, that I can continue.
Well, you have the advantages now of retirement, as do I, and we can do what we really enjoy. And it sounds like you have your work cut out for you, if I can use the term, in connection to retirement. And I think I can, Pam, but it's certainly been a pleasure talking with you this morning. As I said, the recording media is about to run out, so that's why I gave you the signal. I could clip this out, but I think it'll make it more interesting to leave it in.
It's been so much fun to look at that old stuff. Maryland has copies of Copernicus, First Planets, and Catherine Ann Porter's letters, which are going to be digitized. And
Sounds
just
like
neat stuff.
Sounds like you're having a fun time and
I have
not
been.
looking around for things to do because you're bored.
No. Oh no, and I've been privileged to work with some wonderful people, Doug Malcolm, Beth Alvarez, and Hudak, and Turcos. All those people at Maryland have been wonderful to me. Treat me like a queen.
Good. Well, thank you, Pam Gregory, for talking with us this morning. And as I said, it sounds like things are going very well for you, and I'm pleased to hear that.
It's a privilege.